As the 19th century drew to a close, so too did the time of the classic American West. As more and more homesteaders settled in the West, as telegraph networks spread out, along with rail lines connecting the nation ever more tightly, as Western territories evolved and became states, the Wild West was slowly tamed. But first, there was still more work ahead for the great lawmen of the West. Born William Henry McCarthy, Jr. in 1859, the man who would call himself William Bonney and would be called Billy the Kid by everyone else, was one of the most celebrated outlaws of the West. In December 1880, he began to be hunted by the new sheriff of Lincoln County, Pat Garrett. Garrett caught up to Billy and his gang on December 23, 1880.
I had a perfect description of the kid's dress, especially his hat. I had told all the posse that, should the kid make his appearance, it was my intention to kill him, and the rest would surrender. The kid had sworn that he would never yield himself a prisoner, but would die fighting, with a revolver at each ear, and I knew he would keep his word. I was in a position to command a view of the doorway and told my men that when I brought up my gun, to all raise and fire. Before it was fairly daylight, a man appeared at the entrance with a nose bag in his hand, whom I firmly believed to be the kid. His size and dress, especially the hat, corresponded with his description exactly. I gave the signal by bringing my gun to my shoulder, my men raised, and 7 bullets sped on their errand of death. Our victim was Charlie Bowdry. Turning, he reeled back into the house.
Garrett and his men had mistakenly killed a member of Billy's gang instead of Billy.
Watching every movement about the house in the increasing light, I shortly saw a motion of one of the ropes by which the horses were tied, and dropped on the fact that they were attempting to lead one of them inside. My first impulse was to shoot the rope in two, but it was shaking, so I feared to miss. I did better. Just as the horse was fairly in the opening, I shot him and he fell dead, partially barricading the outlet. To prevent another attempt of this kind, I shot the ropes in two which held the other 2 horses, and they walked away. They still had 2 horses in the house, one of them the kid's favorite mare, celebrated for speed, bottom, and beauty. I now opened a conversation with the besieged, of whom the kid was spokesman. I asked him how he was fixed in there. "Pretty well," answered the kid, "but we have no wood to get breakfast." "Come out," said I, "and get some. be a little sociable. About 4 o'clock, the wagon arrived from Wilcox's with provisions and wood. We built a rousing fire and went to cooking. The odor of roasting meat was too much for the famished lads, who were without provisions. Craving stomachs overcame brave hearts. Rudabaugh stuck out from the window a handkerchief that had once been white at the end of a stick, and called to us that they wanted to surrender. I told them that they could all come out with their hands up if they wanted to. Rudabaugh then came out to our camp and said they would all surrender if I would guarantee them protection from violence. This, of course, I did. Rudabaugh returned to the house, where they held a short consultation. In a few moments, they all, the kid, Wilson, Pickett, and Rudabaugh, came out, were disarmed, got their supper, and we took them to Wilcox's. Deputy United States Marshal Tony Neese took the kid and Wilson to Mesilla, where the kid was first tried for the murder of Sheriff William Brady and sentenced to be hung on the 13th day of May, 1881 at Lincoln. On the evening of April 28, 1881, Deputy Marshal Ullinger took all the other prisoners across the street to supper, leaving Bell in charge of the kid in the guardroom. We have but the kid's tale and the sparse information elicited from Mr. Geiss, a German employed about the building, to determine the facts in regard to events immediately following Ullinger's departure. From circumstances, indications, information from Geiss, and the kid's admissions, the popular conclusion is that, at the kid's request, Bell accompanied him downstairs and into the back corral. As they returned, Bell allowed the kid to get considerably in advance. As the kid turned on the landing of the stairs, he was hidden from Bell. He was light and active and, with a few noiseless bounds, reached the head of the stairs, turned to the right, put his shoulder to the door of the room used as an armory. Though locked, this door was well known to open by a firm push. Entered, seized a six-shooter, returned to the head of the stairs just as Bell faced him on the landing of the staircase, some 12 steps beneath, and fired. Bell turned, ran out into the corral and towards the little gate. He fell dead before reaching it.
Billy the Kid escaped that day, but a few months later, near midnight on July 14, 1881, Pat Garrett found him in the home of a mutual friend, Pete Maxwell. Garrett was meeting with Maxwell in the man's darkened bedroom, trying to get information on Billy's whereabouts, never realizing that the kid was in that very house. Pat Garrett quickly became famous, then infamous, for killing Billy the Kid. Over time, Billy's popularity grew, and the man who killed him was seen by some as more a killer than a lawman. Garrett would continue his career in law enforcement, eventually being appointed U.S. Customs Collector for El Paso by President Theodore Roosevelt. He would also, briefly, serve as a captain in the Texas Rangers, that most legendary of Western law enforcement agencies. Perhaps symbolic of the change in the American West was the presidency in the first decade of the 20th century of one of those lawmen. Theodore Roosevelt is famous for his presidency, for his Rough Riders, and for speaking softly while he carried a big stick. But before all of that, Teddy Roosevelt spent some time in the saddle, chasing lawbreakers. Roosevelt was a sickly child, with asthma so bad he often had to sleep propped up in bed so that he could breathe. He wasn't a child you would expect to become a cowboy, lawman, or soldier. But in time, he would become all of these and more. After the deaths of his wife and his mother on the same day in 1884, Roosevelt moved to a ranch in the Dakota Territory, leaving behind his early political career in the New York State Assembly.
It was still the Wild West in those days, the Far West. the West of the Indian and the buffalo hunter, the soldier and the cow puncher. It was a land of vast, silent spaces, of lonely rivers, and of plains where the wild game stared at the passing horsemen. It was a land of scattered ranches, of herds of long-horned cattle, and of reckless riders who, unmoved, looked in the eye of life or of death. In that land we led a free and hardy life, with horses and with rifle. We knew toil and hardship and hunger and thirst, and we saw men die violent deaths as they worked among the horses and cattle or fought in evil feuds with one another. But we felt the beat of hardy life in our veins, and ours was the glory of work and the joy of living.
In the 1880s, the West was still wild.
When I went west, the last great Indian wars had just come to an end, but there were still sporadic outbreaks here and there, and occasionally bands of marauding young braves were a menace to outlying and lonely settlements. Many of the white men were themselves lawless and brutal, and prone to commit outrages on the Indians. Unfortunately, each race tended to hold all the members of the other race responsible for the misdeeds of a few. The first year I was on the Little Missouri, some Sioux bucks ran off all the horses of a buffalo hunter's outfit. One of the buffalo hunters tried to get even by stealing the horses of a Cheyenne hunting party, and when persuaded, made for a cow camp, with, as a result, a long-range skirmish between the Cowboys and the Cheyennes.
Roosevelt, who always found himself taking a leadership role in life, eventually became a lawman, at least part-time.
In addition to my private duties, I sometimes served as deputy sheriff for the northern end of the county. When serving as deputy sheriff, I was impressed with the advantage the officers of the law has over ordinary wrongdoers, provided he thoroughly knows his own mind. There are exceptional outlaws, men with a price on their heads and of remarkable prowess, who are utterly indifferent to taking life, and whose warfare against society is as open as that of a savage on the warpath. The law officer has no advantage whatever over these men save what his own prowess may or may not give him. But the ordinary criminal, even when murderously inclined, feels just a moment's hesitation as to whether he cares to kill an officer of the law engaged in his duty. I took in more than one man who was probably a better man than I was with both rifle and revolver. But in each case I knew just what I wanted to do, and I did it first, whereas the fraction of a second that the other man hesitated put him in a position where it was useless for him to resist.
A few years later, Roosevelt returned to the East and to politics. He became a lawman of the East, in fact, becoming New York City Police Commissioner in 1895 and instituting significant reforms. 2 years later, he was appointed Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Navy, a position he resigned at the outbreak of the Spanish-American War so that he could raise his own volunteer force to go fight in Cuba, the Rough Riders. More formally called the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry, this unit was largely made up of cowboys and frontiersmen.
In all the world, there could be no better material for soldiers than that afforded by these grim hunters of the mountains, these wild, rough riders of the plains. They were accustomed to handling wild and savage horses. They were accustomed to following the chase with the rifle, both for sport and as a means of livelihood. They were hardened to life in the open and to shifting for themselves under adverse circumstances. They had their natural leaders. The captains and lieutenants were sometimes men who had campaigned in the regular army against Apache, Ute, and Cheyenne. In other cases, they were sheriffs, marshals, deputy sheriffs, and deputy marshals, men who had fought Indians and still more often had waged relentless war upon the bands of white desperados. There was Captain Bucky O'Neill of Arizona, a famous sheriff throughout the West for his feats of victorious warfare against the Apache, no less than against the white road agents and man-killers. There was Captain Llewellyn of New Mexico, a good citizen, a political leader, and one of the most noted peace officers of the country. He had been shot 4 times in pitched fights with red marauders and white outlaws. There was Lieutenant Ballard, who had broken up the blackjack gang of ill-known notoriety, and his captain, Curry, another New Mexican sheriff of fame. The officers from the Indian Territory had almost all served as marshals and deputy marshals, and in the Indian Territory, service as a deputy marshal meant capacity to fight stand-up battles with the gangs of outlaws.
Roosevelt gathered volunteers from several spots, including the Menger Hotel Bar in San Antonio, Texas, which is still open today.
We drew a great many recruits from Texas, and from nowhere did we get a higher average, for many of them had served in that famous body of frontier fighters, the Texas Rangers. Of course, these Rangers needed no teaching. They were already trained to obey and to take responsibility. They were splendid shots, horsemen and trailers. They were accustomed to living in the open, to endure great fatigue and hardship, and to encounter all kinds of danger.
Teddy Roosevelt was not the only one to hold the Texas Rangers in high esteem. The Texas Rangers are the oldest state law enforcement agency in the United States. Unofficially created by Stephen Austin in 1823 in response to raids by Comanche, Tonkawa, and Karankawa Indians, the Rangers were initially an irregular military force, defending the sparsely populated territory from Native American raids. For a time, during and after the Mexican-American War, they had a greater focus on Mexico and outlaws crossing that border. Then, after the Civil War, the Rangers were disbanded, replaced by a state police unit under the Union's control until after Reconstruction. Dan W. Roberts described his experience responding to an Indian raid during that period.
The first Indian fight in which I took part occurred in August 1873, which was a little more than a year prior to the time the legislature passed the bill providing for the battalion of Rangers to patrol and protect the immense district which might be properly called the outposts of advanced civilization. The battle was between a small posse of citizens of Round Mountain and a band of marauding Indians which had committed a horrible murder in that neighborhood just a few days before. This butchery was only one of the many which was being perpetrated from day to day along that long stretch of lonely, unprotected border, and afforded convincing proof that some sort of police protection was imperatively needed. The victims of the Indians were Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Phelps, who lived on their ranch near Cypress Creek some 3 miles to the south of Round Mountain, about 50 miles distant from Austin. Mr. and Mrs. Phelps left their home and walked down on Cypress Creek to enjoy a few hours fishing. A short while after, Mr. and Mrs. Phelps left the house. Mrs. Phelps' mother heard the firing of guns in the direction of the creek. She knew only too well the terrible significance of these sounds. The bodies of Mr. and Mrs. Phelps were found on the bank of the creek where they had been murdered and scalped. The Indians then had a start of several hours, which was too big a lead to overcome, even if an armed posse had been ready to take the trail. On the following Sunday, several of the young men of the neighborhood held a council of war. The one resolution introduced and unanimously carried was that the next time the Indians came into our neighborhood, we would follow and fight. We did not have to wait long after the council of war was held. Within just a few days, the report was received that the Indians were in the country to the north of us and were moving south. Our squad with a fighting strength of 10 men. All of us were young men, but we were seasoned plainsmen, inured to the hardships of life on the frontier. We knew how to ride hard and shoot straight. The equipment of arms of our squad was very poor, probably inferior to the equipment of the Indians. I remember that several of the boys had only 6-shooters, and they were not very good ones. I had an old Spencer saddle gun which had been in the Army service. It was a big caliber rifle with a magazine holding 7 shells, and perhaps the best gun in the squad. On the trail, we found where the Indians had killed 2 beeves and carried away practically all of the meat. The big trail of horses tended to confirm our suspicion that we were trailing a big band. We learned later that every horse had a rider. We followed the trail at a gallop when the lay of the ground made that speed possible. After following the trail for 15 miles, we saw an Indian run down from the top of the little hill, from which vantage point he had been spying over the back trail. He was about a quarter of a mile away when we sighted him. We knew that the band must be near and that the fight was about to begin. Putting our horses into a dead run, we moved forward and around the little hill. As we came within range, they opened fire, and our answering volley was fired before we dismounted. With cunning and strategy, they had chosen well the place to be overtaken. As we swept into plain view and into the range of their guns, we realized that every natural advantage was theirs, but we were there to fight. They were entrenched in a little draw or shallow ravine to the right of the hill and far enough distance from the hill to prevent us from using that for a breastwork. Our only means of attack was in the open from the front. To add to their advantage, there was a scrub growth of Spanish oak on each side of the ravine. On the further side of the ravine, their horses were tied. The mare that I was riding was young and badly tired, which left me considerably in the rear when the first volley was fired. When I reached the squad, I found that my brother had been wounded in the first exchange of shots. A big bullet had struck him on the right side of the face, grazing the cheekbone just under the eye, passing through the nose and grazing the left cheekbone as it passed out. An inch higher and farther in would have resulted in instant death. I asked Stanton Jolly to move George out of range and take care of him. This reduced our fighting force to 8 men. We continued to pepper each other as best we could, the final result in doubt from the very beginning. We could not even see when our bullets were finding lodging in their targets. While the others held their ground directly in front, I edged around to the left and finally reached the side of the gully. From this point, I could fire down, and as long as I could hold the position, put the Indians under a sort of crossfire. I had a much better view and could do more effective work from this position. When an Indian would rise from behind the brush to shoot at me, the boys in front had a better shot at him, and when he exposed himself to shoot at the squad, my time came to shoot. The bullet struck all around me, but I used the Indian tactics, jumping from one side to the other of the gully, with my gun always in position to take advantage of an opening for a fair shot. I suspect I must have grown a little bit careless when there was a momentary lull in the firing. I was standing partially exposed with my gun in position when a big bullet struck me on the left thigh, missing the bone and passing entirely through my limb. The shot did not knock me down, but the blood spouted so freely that I thought the main artery had been severed. After carrying George and myself to Johnson's ranch where we could have attention, one of the boys rode over and reported the fight to Captain Rufe Perry, who lived half a mile away. Hastily summoning all the men available, he went at once to the battleground, hoping to resume the fight. We found that the Indians had departed as soon as we ceased firing and gave up.
Then, in 1874, the Texas legislature authorized the recommissioning of the Texas Rangers under Major John B. Jones. Again, Dan Roberts.
In May 1874, I made all my plans and arrangements to remove to the territory of New Mexico to engage in business. Just before I made the start, I received a brief letter from Captain Rufe Perry, who had been commissioned a captain and placed in command of Company D. The letter read as follows: "Meet me in Austin, May 10th. I had not the remotest idea of what he desired, but the letter had an imperative ring, so I went to Austin, and a few minutes after my arrival at the Capitol, I met Captain Perry on Congress Avenue as he was coming down from the Capitol building. After we had exchanged greetings, he handed me a document without making any comment. The document was a commission as second lieutenant that had been signed a few minutes before by Governor Richard Koch. With the remark, "Well, I guess you've got me," I accepted the commission and became one of the charter members of Company D of the Ranger Battalion. I returned home for my equipment and joined the company on its march for the frontier. Captain Perry, as commander of a company which was to remain on the frontier, naturally selected some of the members of the company from the men whom he knew personally. It was necessary to have men who were more or less acquainted with life on the border and accustomed to the hardships.
The Rangers continued fighting against Indian raids, but soon took on new duties.
After we had been in the service about 4 months, we found that we would be compelled to assist civil officers in the enforcement of law on the frontier. Consequently, Major Jones conceived the idea of some fine constructive work in procuring a list from each county in the state of the criminals, many of whom had fled to the frontier to hide from the law. This, all added up, made a considerable book. A copy of this book was furnished to each company of the battalion. Several times we found our neighbors were wanted on important business in the counties they hailed from. A very accurate description was given of men charged with crime, and that was what caught them oftener than names. Every visible scar, or any peculiar movement, or any peculiarity of speech, taking in the color of the hair, height, age, and color of the eyes, that were all given. My men got so thoroughly trained by observance that a man's name only counted for a starter for his true identity. They all studied the fugitive list more than the Bible. Some of the sheriffs became a little lazy and depended on the Rangers a little too much, while others were jealous of the Rangers in getting to their men first. The Ranger posse was always ready. We generally turned over prisoners to the sheriffs unless it was some bad hombre that needed a safer jail than the frontier counties had. By this time, the citizens had learned that we were good neighbors and began to fall into line. They could see the gleam of hope in our presence cheered them. They would ride to the camp from many miles away, no matter how dark the night, to give me information regarding Indians or outlaws.
The Texas Rangers captured numerous notorious outlaws, including the infamous John Wesley Hardin, who was said to be so mean that he once shot a man for snoring. N.A. Jennings was a Texas Ranger at that time.
The name of John Wesley Hardin was dreaded from one end of Texas to the other. Let it be rumored that Hardin was in a county, and that county became panic-stricken. When he rode into town, the town and all its inhabitants were at his mercy and hastened to do his bidding. If any person dared to thwart his will, another killing was added to Hardin's list. All the other bad men were as much afraid of John Wesley Hardin as peaceable citizens were afraid of them. He was a marvelous shot with a six-shooter. He could shoot with his left hand as well as with his right. He could twirl a six-shooter around his finger, by the trigger guard, so rapidly that it looked like a wheel, and then, at the word, fire and hit the mark. He could fire a Winchester repeating rifle so rapidly that a continuous stream of fire came from the muzzle. He killed men on the slightest provocation, and on no provocation at all. He never forgave an injury, and to incur his displeasure was simply suicide. When the Rangers began to make things so hot for the desperadoes in and near DeWitt County, Hardin disappeared. Try as we might, we could learn nothing of his whereabouts. Connected with the Rangers, and on the payrolls, were 2 or 3 men who were only known to the captain. They were the detectives of our force. One of these men was John Duncan. By order of Captain McNelly, Duncan had, months before, undertaken to find John Wesley Hardin. To this end, Duncan hired the ranch adjoining that owned by Hardin's father, the preacher. The Ranger detective cultivated the friendship of the old man, but did it with such deliberation and naturalness that his identity or purpose was never suspected.
The Rangers' undercover detective, John Duncan, was eventually able to spy the address on a letter being sent by Hardin's father to Pensacola, Florida. Duncan gathered 4 other rangers, and they all set out for Pensacola. They discovered that he regularly traveled a certain train route, visiting a girlfriend, and they arranged to be at the train stop ahead of him. Texas Ranger John Armstrong entered the train looking for Hardin.
When the train arrived, Armstrong entered the car where Hardin sat, walking in at the forward end. Hardin and a companion were the only occupants of the car. Another of the Rangers entered the car at the rear door and took the seat immediately behind Hardin and his friend. The other officers remained outside, near their platforms. Hardin paid no attention to Armstrong and the other Ranger until Armstrong reached the place where the desperado was sitting. Then Armstrong looked at Hardin straight in the eye and said, "How are you, John Wesley Hardin?" With a motion as quick as a flash, Hardin threw back his hand for his 6-shooter, but the Ranger who was behind him was expecting this and caught the outlaw's arm and hung on to it. Hardin's companion drew his 6-shooter, however, and Armstrong immediately put a bullet in his head. Then a fight with Hardin began all over the car. He kicked and bit like a wildcat, trying his best all the while to get at his revolver. It took 5 minutes to handcuff and disarm him. Without waiting for requisition papers, or even to notify the Florida officers of the capture, Armstrong and his party started for Texas. They actually kidnapped Hardin and were going through Alabama before they were stopped. Then an officious lawyer got an order from an Alabama court, which delayed the party 24 hours. The news that John Wesley Hardin was on the train drew great crowds, all through Louisiana and eastern Texas, to the stations. As the party approached Austin, the crowds grew larger and larger. In Austin itself, the streets near the railroad station were filled with a crowd, and it was whispered that a lot of DeWitt County desperados were there to rescue Hardin. This rumor reached the ears of the Rangers who had gathered in Austin, and they telegraphed to Armstrong. The consequence was that Hardin was taken off the train on the outskirts of Austin and conveyed to the jail by the Rangers on horseback before the crowd at the depot knew what had happened.
John Wesley Hardin was sent to Huntsville prison. He tried to escape more than once, but he eventually settled into prison life. One of his fellow prisoners at Huntsville was more successful. Joe Horner, whose criminal history included assaults, cattle rustling, bank robbery, stagecoach robbery, and multiple escapes from custody, somehow managed to get placed on an off-site work detail. Horner somehow managed to escape his chains and slip off from the work gang, at which point Joe Horner disappeared completely, replaced by Frank Canton. Leaving his outlaw life in Texas along with his old name, Frank Canton moved to Wyoming where, after a few months proving himself a reliable worker on cattle ranches, he was hired by the Wyoming Stock Growers Association as an inspector. He had gone from rustling cattle to chasing cattle rustlers. Years later, he was made a deputy sheriff, a position which gave him the authority to make arrests while performing his duties as an inspector for the Growers Association. But he had to resign from the WSGA when, in 1882, he was elected sheriff of Johnson County. He had a good track record as sheriff and was re-elected to a second term. Then, in 1887, he returned to the WSGA as a detective.
Daily Yellowstone Journal, April 19, 1887. Ex-Sheriff Frank Canton, who held the office of sheriff for 2 terms in Johnson County, has been designated by the Wyoming Stock Growers Convention as the chief of the Stock Detective Force of Northern Wyoming. Mr. Canton's success during office has marked him as the most efficient detective in all that territory, and he is conceded to be second to none in ability, courage, and experience.
Being a detective with the WSGA meant working for the big ranchers and cattle barons of Wyoming, and working for the big ranchers meant working against the smaller ones. The Wyoming cattle barons considered these smaller ranchers to be cattle rustlers, building ranches with cattle stolen from more prominent cattlemen. There was some truth to this in some cases, but when the cattle barons took a case built by Frank Canton against a smaller rancher to court, the court came down on the side of the small rancher. After that, the cattle barons weren't taking their cases to court. The smaller ranchers were being killed off, sometimes dragged out of their homes and lynched. Frank Canton, by now also a deputy U.S. Marshal, in addition to being the WSGA detective, was arrested for the murder of one of those alleged rustlers.
The Salt Lake City Herald, December 10, 1891. Deputy United States Marshal Frank Canton, arrested on the charge of murdering one of the rustlers found dead on the road in Johnson County last week, was acquitted on the preliminary hearing. The prosecution had 20 witnesses. The only important evidence was by one who saw a distinguished man, he believed to be Canton, riding from the scene of the Tisdale murder. His testimony was quite strong, but a businessman made out an alibi for Canton. This, it is believed, ends the trouble. A number of the small ranchmen, classed as rustlers, declare that they leave Wyoming in the spring for fear of being assassinated.
But the trouble did not end. The Johnson County War was about to heat up. The cattle barons hired a private army of so-called regulators, mostly from Texas. The group was led by Frank Wolcott, who had been a major in the Union Army. But soon Frank Canton was the de facto leader. The private army raced up from Denver on a train and then headed out toward the Johnson County seat in Buffalo, Wyoming.
Omaha Daily Bee, April 8, 1892. Casper, Wyoming. Tuesday night, a special Union Pacific train came in here from the south, loaded with armed men and stock growers' representatives. Upwards of 100 men left here yesterday, and along their line of march, they compelled men to travel with them. Bert Lambert and Oscar Lyman, sheepmen of this place, were held as prisoners for 6 hours. No one can guess the outcome, but it is generally thought that blood will flow and there will be a cleanup of one side or the other. The regulators are led by some of the wealthiest citizens of the state, and the men are armed with improved weapons and ride fine horses. Never was there greater excitement than prevails here today, as no one knows what such a powerful force will do or whom they're after. This afternoon, the information was circulated in the northern towns to the effect that an armed force had entered Johnson County with the expressed intention of cleaning out the rustlers. Telegraphic communication to Buffalo, the county seat of Johnson County, is secured by way of Douglas. The line north of the latter point is down or has been cut for the past 24 hours. Consequently, nothing can be heard except rumors.
The rustlers are attempting to class all small ranchmen with themselves, and if they can make the ranchers believe the army is after them as well as the rustlers, the fight is no picnic for the army, and they may have provoked a fight they cannot win. No one here doubts that the cattlemen from Texas to Montana are mixed up in this, and that a most determined effort is being made to protect the cattle business. Bringing cattle from Texas and running them here on the free range is an exceedingly profitable business, and the cattlemen don't propose to see this industry run out of the country.
April 10th, 1892. All kinds of rumors are afloat, and it's generally believed here that this afternoon, if the army is bent on extermination, the work is commenced.
Omaha Daily Bee, April 11, 1892. The town is a walking arsenal. If the ringleader's object is to kill off all his private enemies on this trip, about 1/2 the population must be on the list.
Omaha Daily Bee, April 13, 1892. The party which left Cheyenne 1 week ago got to Nate Champion's ranch at 4 o'clock Saturday morning, surrounded the house, and an almost continuous fire was kept up until afternoon. Champion, Nick Ray, and perhaps another man were in the house. The regulators took a load of hay and backed it against the house, thus sheltering themselves from Champion's bullets, and then set fire to the hay, burning the house and Ray, who had been shot. Champion had to run, and as he did so, he received 10 or 12 bullets. Sunday morning, the regulators took breakfast at the T.A. Ranch, 14 miles south of Buffalo, and then started for town. They were met by rustlers and citizens and retreated back to the ranch. At this time, there were not over 25 of the rustlers and citizens. By Monday morning, the force was much larger and closed in about the ranch. The first shots exchanged between the two parties were fired Monday morning by the regulators. The regulators have a well-nigh impregnable position.
By that time, the regulators had about 45 men, and the growing band of alleged rustlers and citizens facing them had about 175. The murder of Nate Champion and Nick Ray, on top of prior attacks, had the smaller ranchers and citizens enraged, particularly against this army of outsiders. The group of citizens said that they would be willing to let regulators surrender to the militia if the militia promised to hand them over to the proper civil authorities.
April 14, 1892. At 3 o'clock this morning, Colonel Van Horn with 3 companies of cavalry from Fort McKinney started to the T.A. Ranch. The President, at the request of the Governor, issued the necessary orders for the troops to assist the civil authorities. When they arrived at the scene, it was found that the besiegers had increased to probably 1,000 persons, some of whom had come from adjoining counties. These were invariably small ranchmen distinct from the rustlers, who believed that their lives and homes were in danger from the invasion.
The regulators surrendered and were put under guard at Fort McKinney. Then the names came out, and these included Deputy U.S. Marshal Frank Canton. The regulators were moved to Fort D.A. Russell, where they were held for 10 weeks. But eventually, charges were all dropped and everyone went home. Both sides of the Johnson County War claimed that they were in the right. As happened often in the West, both sides had lawmen supporting them. But the actions taken by the WSGA, hiring a gang of killers, were shocking then and now. Frank Canton went on from Johnson County, later becoming a deputy U.S. Marshal in Oklahoma and again in Alaska. He was a successful and respected lawman, despite the controversies of the Johnson County War. But in his heart, he knew he was still Joe Horner, a fugitive from Texas. Late in life, he arranged a secret meeting with the governor of Texas and confessed the truth. The governor took Canton's decades of service as a lawman under consideration and pardoned him. The days of the Wild West were drawing to an end. The Western territories were being admitted to the Union as states. Waves of settlers continued to move west, including millions of immigrants. The network of telegraph wires was spreading, creating a better, faster information network for law enforcement. Photography was becoming more common, so that outlaws' images could be shared among lawmen, making them much easier to identify. High-speed locomotives, designed specifically to carry a posse quickly to wherever it was needed, made escape all the more difficult. These last advances conspired to bring down the last great outlaws of the West. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and their wild bunch of outlaws, riding the outlaw trail between the hole in the wall and Robber's Roost, were highly successful train robbers. But the Pinkerton detectives and other lawmen hounded them. Those high-speed locomotives were designed specifically to take down the wild bunch, and in the last years of the 1800s, much of the gang were captured or killed. When a photograph of the gang was discovered in 1900, the Pinkertons were able to plaster Butch Cassidy's face on wanted posters throughout the West. Finally, Butch and Sundance, with Sundance's girlfriend, Etta Place, fled the country, eventually reaching Buenos Aires, Argentina. It is believed that Butch and Sundance were killed by soldiers in Bolivia in 1908. But rumors persisted that the outlaws killed were not the famous duo, and that one or both of them eventually returned to America and lived quiet lives. Even as it was becoming tame, its legendary status as the Wild West continued to grow. Buffalo Bill Cody, that one-time Pony Express rider and recipient of the Medal of Honor for his service as a scout, had now spent decades touring with his Wild West show. By the time Butch Cassidy was supposedly killed in Bolivia in 1908, Buffalo Bill had taken his Wild West on 8 separate tours of Europe, bringing the American frontier to the world. Buffalo Bill's shows would set the stage for decades of Western films to come. Like Cody, John Wayne, and Will Rogers, and a host of filmmakers would try to capture a bit of the spirit of the American West and deliver it to an audience that could only dream about it. Though outlaws were certainly not gone forever, and lawmen would always be needed, the American West was no longer the wild place it had been. Theodore Roosevelt would one day write,
I owe more than I can ever express to the West, which of course means to the men and women I met in the West. There were a few people of bad type in my neighborhood that would be true of every group of men, but I could not speak with too great affection and respect of the great majority of my friends and hard-working men and women. That land of the West has gone now, gone to the Isle of Ghosts and of strange, dead memories. It was right and necessary that this life should pass, for the safety of our country lies in its being made the country of the small homemaker. The great unfenced ranches in the days of free grass necessarily represented a temporary stage in our history. But the homesteaders, the permanent settlers, the men who took up each his own farm on which he lived and brought up his family, these represented from the national standpoint the most desirable of all possible dwellers on the soil.
That is undoubtedly true. But those homesteaders, and therefore the nation, would forever owe a debt to the great lawmen of the West.